As the first 2 weeks of the 2025 to 26 NBA season come underway, I can't help but notice that the NBA is in a state of crisis. I'm going to keep this one short because it's a tough one to talk about, but the NBA is in a state of crisis, and I'm going to list two reasons as to why the NBA is floundering and it needs to get back up on its feet sooner rather than later if they don't want the sport of basketball to plummet down the drain. The first one I'm going to say are the TV deals. The NBA has just signed a TV deal, an 11-year TV deal that was valued at approximately $76 billion with partners Disney through ESPN and ABC, NBC, which also has Peacock, and Prime Video. And this ultimately ended the long partnership of NBA on TNT, which lasted all the way from 1989 and aired their last game at the end of May in 2025. This is a long-standing program, and now it's gone because of this new TV deal. And unfortunately, what you may wonder, well, what do I mean when I'm saying the TV deals have something to do with a crisis? Well, because if you look at the big four sports, the big four leagues, you have the NBA, the NFL, the NHL, and the MLB, you will notice that the NBA is the only league that does not focus primarily on regular sports through regular channels like on TV. If you turn on your TV and go through regular channels, you will always find MLB games through SNY or Yes or any of the other channels if they're for your local team. The NHL has NHL on TNT, NHL on ESPN, but they also have some on regular other channels as well, usually in the later window during the night. And of course, the NFL, you always find a game on Fox or a game on NBC, something like that. Depending on which area of the country you live in, you'll get a certain game. There's always games for the country. Whereas the NBA doesn't primarily focus on that. They mostly encourage people to go watch the NBA games on their platforms like ESPN and ABC, which mostly requires subscriptions through maybe like Disney Plus or something like that. Or if you have the NBA app and you need to get the subscription through that, that is another option. The problem with this is that this format of primarily focusing on a subscription based platforming system doesn't appeal to the casual person. The casual person is going to flip on the television and just find any sort of sports game to watch. They're not going to want to pay subscriptions to constantly find basketball games. And eventually, these people are just going to be like, oh, we're just going to go watch the highlights on YouTube. And that's why there was a lot of debate over the last offseason as to these rumors about the NBA potentially getting rid of all TV channeled games. And now with their new deal with Prime Video broadcasting like 66 games or something like that, this is what I believe is their last ditch effort to try to appeal to the casual user because a lot of people have Amazon Prime. We saw how the NFL and their experiment with Amazon Prime as well as NASCAR, and those were great experiments. The NBA, the games are usually way later in the night. But with Thursday night football on Prime, people seem to work with that. So we'll see if the NBA on Prime and their broadcasting team will help them out. But with this NBA state of crisis and their TV deal problems, again, it's mostly appealing to a subscription based outcome, which, again, personally to me, I'd rather watch the highlights because I'm not going to go through all that hassle. And the games are at night, so I'm not even going to watch the games to the very end, probably. And that's going to lead to the second reason because I'm probably not even going to watch the game in general. Why? And this is point number two. The second point I have here is that the NBA, I mean, this could be extremely controversial and have a lot of different opinions. To me, the NBA isn't fun to watch anymore. And I'll tell you why. And it basically has to do with a little history. If you look at the history of the NBA, all the way back from the beginning in the early 50s and you go through the 70s, the approach to the NBA was similar to college football in that you had regions of teams and the team was basically a giant entity that people would rally around. People had their favorite players on the team, but in general, the players weren't necessarily household names that really stood out as big athletes, and that led to a lot of huge juggernauts, like the Celtics dynasty in the late 50s to the mids to the rest of the 60s, and then eventually the 70s dominance with the Lakers. And there were a few household names. There were a couple of exceptions that made their names in this era, like Bill Russell or Wilt Chamberlain or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. But again, overall, if you looked at a random team in that era that wasn't top tier but wasn't also the worst, you wouldn't really remember any of the team's players because again, people just rallied around them. It's similar to college football where people are diehard supporters of their teams, but since it's college, there's always going to be rotating players. So people don't really find a genuine love to the players. They don't grow such a deep attachment because they know they're eventually going to leave. So they eventually just support team as a whole, as a collective body. This changed entering the 1980s when players such as Magic Johnson and Larry Bird started their famous rivalry, and this allowed people to start realizing the more player identities, and of course, with the emergence of Michael Jordan in the mid 1980s. And this transitioned in the 1990s, which, of course, the 1990s to the 2000s is the peak of NBA basketball. No question about it. Why? I'll tell you why. Because this is how the NBA turned into a global phenomenon. With players like Michael Jordan, who turned into a global celebrity, the NBA became international. And I'll tell you why. It's because every player made their own brand. Every player essentially became their own celebrity in that regard. But the best part is that they were still unified in a team. Like if you go, for example, to the 1997-98 Bulls, I guarantee you any normal fan that actually follows the sports and knows stats and stuff can tell you every single player on that roster or damn near close to all of them. And that's pretty good. Imagine, and these are players that aren't even household names, that some of those players on that roster. That just goes to show you how much of a unified body the team was, but then the player had a good amount of recognition on their own that the NBA was just wide open. Like if you go to the late 90s to the early 2000s, you could name a bunch of NBA players that are superstars. Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Tim Duncan, David Robinson, Sean Kemp, Gary Payton, Kobe Bryant, Shaq, Penny Hardaway, Allen Iverson. The list just goes on and on and on. There's so many players in this era. I can't even imagine to list them all. And this transition into the 2000s. But heading into the late 2000s, into the 2010s, the NBA unfortunately took a turn that ultimately led to this crisis. So, seeing how the 90s to the early 2000s established this wide range of great players, everyone knew them, the teams, it was top tier. The team devotion by the fans was astronomical. But heading into the 2010s, but starting in the late 2000s especially, the NBA sort of changed their dynamic in showing their players. Instead of changing it from this wide group of people on the same level, they changed it into a sort of pyramid system where the top echelon of players were the players that always broke crazy records or the superstars of the game, and nobody necessarily remembered anyone else on the team. So some of these players include LeBron James, Stephen Curry, Russell Westbrook, Kyrie Irving. The list goes on, players like that from the last decade in the 2010s. Those were the top players. But if you notice, that's just the top echelon. Nobody really remembers the mid-tier players that didn't do so many crazy things like have a bunch of points or whatever. People don't remember those players. I can't remember them at the moment because I'm trying to record this into a camera. But again, that just goes to show you how the pyramid system works in the NBA. People remember only the top tier of players that are winning championships, that are scoring a bunch of points, but no one's necessarily remembering the people that have many assists or are team leaders on the ground. Like, for example, like Jason Kidd in the 2000s. He wasn't a crazy point scorer, but he was the team leader of many different teams and is second in all-time NBA assists. But a player like that in the NBA now, nobody would remember him because they're not scoring points. And combined with the change of the game of basketball in the NBA, back then scoring was way lower. It was way more common to have games end in the high 70s to the low 80s or maybe even the high 80s because there was so much more defense. But eventually, as we transition now into the 2025-26 season, we see that the game has transitioned into a more lax. The offense has a distinct advantage over the defense, and there are many players from back then that say this now, and the free throw rate is way higher than it has been ever before, and the foul rate has been higher. The offensive player has a distinct advantage. That's why these games go into such high scores, like the hundreds, 110s, or maybe even the 120s. And for me, I don't think that's kind of fun. I love the defensive aspect of the game, but if it's just scoring, whoever's going to have the ball last is going to win. I'm not necessarily along for the ride. And that's usually why I can never really make it through even 3/4 of an NBA game most of the time. I lose interest in the game because it's just back and forth. No, just one guy is always scoring, or maybe one or two. The household names for the team that are leading the team, like Donovan Mitchell or SGA or Tyrese Halliburton, just it's always them. No one else is going to be that guy that becomes a great player. It's again stuck in the pyramid system. Nobody remembers the mid-tier players, which is personally, I love just the wide thing. Everyone needs their chance to ball out and to be recognized, but that's not how the NBA is now. And that's another reason why this is the second issue for this NBA crisis. There is one player, however, that is potentially becoming a superstar in their own right in the way of the wide phenomenon that I'll talk about in another video. If I had already created it, there's already a card on the top right of your screen about this player. But other than him, nobody else is really making this thing go like make is changing the NBA. It's just drastically feels the same every game, unfortunately. And coming with LeBron James, Stephen Curry, and these other players from the 2010s coming to the end of their careers, and these new rookies and prospects aren't really living up to super high expectations. The status of the NBA, the league, the competition is unknown heading into the 2030s, especially. And I hope the NBA can get out of this crisis as soon as possible. With the TV deals, the whole list of the exact details for this new TV deal that was signed last season, you can look that up anytime. I didn't do it because that would just be too long for me to list on the screen. And now the dynamic of competition and its pyramid system is ruining the game of basketball in the National Basketball Association. I just wanted to point that out. I hope the NBA can get out of this crisis because it has such amazing roots. Everyone looks back to those games in the late 90s or the early 2000s or even the mid 2000s had great games like the 2006 NBA Finals, for instance. And unfortunately, as they transitioned in the late 2000s and in the 2010s, the games just, of course, there were obviously games that are notable in that era. Not that it's not like that era is completely just ignored and boring. There are, of course, classics, the 2016 NBA Finals or the NBA Finals where Portland beat Chicago or whatever. The Damian Lillard hit that 3-point shot. I think that was like 2012 or 2013, something like that. There were countless good games. There's a lot of good games, but overall, in a collective sense, over the regular seasons, which is like what 10 years or 12 years, something like that, from that whole era, late 2000s to the rest of the 2010s, is definitely a serious regression over its peak from around 25 to 30 years ago. I hope the NBA can get out of this crisis. Just wanted to air my thoughts out there in the early part of the NBA season. I hope you guys enjoyed that and understand, resonate with me. If you guys have your own opinions or whatever, you can share it in the comments. Of course, this is all my opinion. Some people can think this is the peak of basketball, although I'll think you're insane. Um, but again, just wanted to say what I thought about the NBA. And that's why a lot of people ask me why I don't make too many NBA videos. Not only because it's tough to get a bunch of details, but I don't find so much interest in doing videos on the NBA now outside of a few specific topics because of these reasons. The NBA is in a state of crisis, and I hope it gets out of it soon. Hope you guys like that video. Please like, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.